Hi folks, I'm Stephen Croney. Thanks for joining me again for the watercolour demo. Many thanks to all the patrons at patreon.com/Stephen Croney. Support is always very much appreciated. Thank you as always. Coastal scene for you today. Just use the 4 colours to try and keep everything as simple as I could. So let me show you the palette I've used. So there was 4 colours. There was ultramarine, Payne's grey, raw sienna, and then I've also used, which really helps with coastal scenes, bit of Chinese white. Brushes, I use pretty much every brush. I've got the large hake, the small hake, the little flat brush, and I've got the sword, and then a couple of rigger brushes. I use most of those, trying to develop all the various techniques. So I'm kicking this one off with a bit of raw sienna. So it was just the 3 colours. So no, tell a lie, 4 colours with this one. I've got the raw sienna, ultramarine, Payne's grey, and for something different, I thought I'd try some Chinese white, which I knew would come in handy when I'm trying to paint the sea and the waves and all that sort of stuff. But not only that, just to give I think the background makes it a lot easier. Softening, just making all the tones really pale, and helping to create that sort of depth. We'll come to that in a bit anyway. So for the time being, I'm just starting off with a bit of raw sienna, adding a bit of ultramarine, bringing it from the sky all the way down to the sea area. I mean, the horizon line's pretty high on this one. We're sort of a good 3/4 of the way up the page. So this one's all about, very little sky, this one's all about the sort of sea and the rocks and the cliffs and that coastline. I haven't used the Chinese white for some time, but I was just using it, whereas all the other colours are dried. I've used it neat, straight out of the tube, because that was going to come in handy for, like I say, the waves and stuff. I think that is the one colour I wouldn't use dry. I'd pretty much always use the white, I think, fresh, if not the other ones. So, sticking with the large hake brush, I do go through quite a few brushes in this one, but starting with the large hake, just starting to put in the distant headland. Now this is going to be like, I'll soften this off in a bit, because I want this really, really light to contrast, and then put the nearer stuff in really dark, shadowy foreground, strong, bold colours, just to contrast nicely. So this is just a bit too dark at the moment. I'll soften it off in a bit. And then just brushing a little bit of the colour. Again, this will all be softened off into the sea area. Incidentally, you didn't see me wet the paper at the start of this one. I thought for something different, I just did it at the sink. I just ran a tap over both sides of the paper, so it was already wet and had stretched before I started painting. So I think you can see now I've switched to the little hake brush. I'm trying to put in a bit more intense raw sienna and bring it down just over a little bit over the tops of the landmass there. I generally use the big brush, the large hake, which is about 1 3/4 inches, so it's quite a big wide brush for getting on lots of colour really quick. Lots of colours and tones, just to cover the paper really, really quick. And then use the smaller brushes just to sort of fine tune everything, whether it's the colours or the contrast. And often I'll switch to a little 1/4 inch flat brush to really fine tune the tones then. Especially when I want the really dark areas. But for now, you can see I'm just starting to put in now the first of the closer cliffs, but this one will remain quite distant, so that one will soften off. There's a distinct diagonal that will become apparent later in the painting, where it switches from the light tones in the background to the stronger, darker tones in the foreground. That helps create that sense of depth and distance. So I've gone into the white. I'm just starting to add a little bit of that white to the sea area. Twofold, the reasons for this. A, it creates some nice sort of wave effects, but also it's sort of lightening that section because it was a bit too dark and I wanted it a little bit lighter. So what I'm doing, if you can, I'm just running some diagonals up to a sort of vanishing point, just to suggest those ripples, waves and ripples on the beach. So these cliffs are predominantly ultramarine and Payne's grey, and the one I'm putting in is it this one or is it the next one? Now this one will be. Will recede. This will have to go a bit lighter, just to recede into the background. And then while I'm doing the cliffs, there's a few rocks scattered about in the sea as well. So they all help add interest to the scene. Also gives you something to add a bit of white to, just to crash the waves against. Get that sort of sea spray effect when you're using the white. But for now, I'm just working out the sort of general composition of the thing. Now you can see this cliff I'm putting in now. This will be the first of the closer ones, the stronger, bolder colours. It's not as apparent as well just yet because I haven't softened off the cliff behind it, but this will be that diagonal line I was talking about earlier, this distinction between the sort of background and the foreground, and that sense of depth and distance. But the foreground ones will have to go in quite dark. You'll have noticed when you saw the painting at the start, the completed painting. I mean, probably did about 3 or 4 different washes, really, drying between each one just to build it up in layers to get that really dark tone. So you can see the painting just slowly starting to take shape. Most of that sort of top right hand side is getting somewhere near complete. So just defining now these left hand cliff edges, and also just trying to darken some of the rocks and cliffs that I've already done, as well as just constantly just playing with the sea area, just trying to add interest, just marks here and there with the dark or the light. So now just continuing this cliff face closer and closer to the foreground. So there's going to be sort of dark cliffs with little bits of raw sienna to suggest bits of grass on the cliff tops, just to distinguish each layer of cliff. So the little hake, the small hake's working pretty well, really. And if in this one, which I haven't painted many like this, so I wasn't quite sure how it was going to turn out, at least with the small hake, yeah, it gives you that chance of just because your brush strokes aren't as big, of just doing it a little bit, just being a little bit more cautious. Whereas in the normally with the big ache, I just go at it like 100 mile an hour. I've had to slow down for this one because it's an unfamiliar subject. Although in time I would like to explore this sort of subject, because I think one of the areas where I get frustrated is if I go on holiday. This is the sort of walk I'd do along the cliff tops, looking down at the sea. It's an ideal sort of walk, but I've very rarely painted this sort of thing. So I wanted to try and bring that together, my sort of holiday walks and actually painting them, rather than just doing like woodland scenes and rivers and the more familiar, common stuff that I've done in the past. So you can see where I've added a lot of raw sienna now, and this is sort of representing little bits of grass. I've done it in raw sienna because it was a limited palette. It's a lot easier to keep all the colours harmonious and not get any clashes. And I was more concerned about getting the tones right. So the raw sienna here, it's sort of representing the sort of the light in the sky, the yellow sand of the beach, and also reflecting some of that sky colour in the water. And it also it's the same colour to suggest the grass rather than use the yellow. Again, just so I could use those three main colours plus the white to try and keep it as harmonious as I could, so that I could just focus my main focus into the tones, which I really wanted to get right, because it was crucial to get that sort of the diagonal, the distant tones lighter and the closer ones stronger. So I'm still using the little height now, and just looking to darken that cliff with a bit of Payne's grey, a little bit of ultramarine, but a lot of Payne's grey in there as well. And then also what you I might have paused it, I can't remember now, but there'll be a bit of drying. I'm not quite sure if that will come up on the video. I can't remember if it was paused when I was drying, but if you bear in mind when you're trying to darken an area by putting on 2 or 3 or 4 different layers of wash, you need to dry it between each layer, because all you're doing, you're just mixing wet paint around the paper. It needs to be dry. So apply the wash, dry it, and then apply the wash again, dry it, and it will just build up over time. It'll just get darker and darker and darker. I know as a beginner, like many, I was guilty of a lot of sort of beginners' watercolours. They look very washed out. There's no sort of tonal strength in there, and that just comes with experience. So just brushing around, a bit of ultramarine, a little bit of white in there as well. Just creating a few brush strokes in this sort of foreground sea area. Also just pulling down a little bit of reflection as well off those rocks into the water. So I know at this point, as I mentioned before, about drying in between stages. I know that the darks have to go on a bit darker than this, so I know I was having to get the air dried out. And it also helps fix what you've already done, really. I think otherwise I'd just end up going on and on and on painting and just overdoing it. I think when you get the air dried out, you sort of subconsciously that sort of fixed that part of the painting now, and you just want to. I just want to focus then on moving on, getting the rest of it done before I overwork areas. So I've gone back to the big brush now, just to bash in some darks again. But you can see now how these darker ones now are contrasting against the lighter tones in the background. It's just slowly building up over time. But I haven't used this many brushes. I mean, I've also got to use the sword liner as well yet. I can't remember if the rigger made an appearance. But I mean, the brushes, it's like horses for courses. I think for too long, I just had the 3 brushes really, just the big hake, a 3/4 flat, which, to be honest, I've never really found a use for it. The 3/4 flat brush. I suppose that's more for doing buildings and stuff, but buildings are another thing. I must have a go at those. I did try a smaller one the other day, just a little 7x5, which was fairly happy with it. And the number 3 rigger, but in recent times I added a size 0, just for doing like small, really tiny, like little figures in the distance, things like that. And the little 1/4 inch flat, which I use for just adjusting the tones. So I've been, again, just sticking there with the large hake, and I'm just sort of playing around with that water area. Just trying to get that sort of blend of colour just right. Because this beach, it's like it's a sort of a little beach. The water's just about coming in, so it's sort of sandy with a bit of wetness as well, a bit of sort of sea over it as well. So just getting that sort of blend of raw sienna and ultramarines, a little bit of reflections from the rocks. So the tones now, these darker ones, just slowly starting to come together now. But now, see, now this is where I really want to start adjusting the tones a bit. So I've switched to my little 1/4 inch flat brush, which is my sort of go-to tool. For my go-to tool for adjusting the tonal values. And you can see now I've just dipped into the white, and I just want to create that waterline in the distance against that land mass. So just pulling it as straight as I could. I just wanted it sort of horizontal. And using Chinese white as well, rather than gouache. I don't know if gouache is just slightly too white. I haven't quite decided yet what I'd use long term. Still experimenting really with the whites. I know the traditionalists will say that you're supposed to preserve the white of the paper and maybe use the the masking fluid, but I've never been able to take to it really. I've always been a bit jealous of like oil painters, the way they can just whack the darks in and then just put the white over the top. So I thought, well, you know, why not? I'd like to be able to paint like that rather than have to preserve the whites. So you can see now I'm just pulling out now, just adding a bit of blue and white, just to make that bit of cliff similar-ish to that distant land, just slightly darker, almost like a sort of midway point between the foreground and the background. So that was a sort of mix of sort of Chinese white and ultramarine there. You can see how that differs from the darks of the foreground cliffs and rocks. And it's almost closer to the distant, that sort of light blue of the distant land there. Now I'm predominantly Payne's grey. I did a lot more Payne's grey to the mix. And darkening these again. And that's about as dark as it gets, really. Once I've applied these dark washes with this 1/4 inch brush, I'm pretty much there then, pretty much satisfied with the tonal values. And then I think it was just a case of trying to get a few of these sprays, sort of water sprays in with the whites. But for now, just still working on these darks. I know that closer cliff bit needs to darken just there. But for now, just adding a bit of raw sienna. This is representing the sort of a little bit of grass on the cliff top. But as I said before, I didn't use yellow because I just wanted to keep the palette as limited as I possibly could. So I just wondered if I actually went too dark, possibly, I'm not sure. But I certainly decided at this point it was time to stop making them too dark. Just defining that little bit of edge. That's that raw sienna in the foreground. That's just suggesting a little bit of grass on the, if you can imagine the viewpoint of the person looking at this scene, where they'd be stood. But the whole thing's it's slowly starting to come together. And I think at this point I was almost there, I think. I'm starting to get quite satisfied that it's certainly dark enough. As I say, I'm not quite sure looking at it now whether it was just slightly too dark. Maybe. But it's all a learning process. And I've learned something for the next painting. But for now, once I've come down right into the foreground, I know then it's time to start getting out a little bit of the white and start playing with the water a little bit. But I'm just defining some of these edges, just coming close to the foreground. Just add a few darks to suggest the sort of few nooks and crannies, and then just back in a bit more raw sienna, just to strengthen some that sort of raw sienna colour. But again, it's a balance between getting on some nice colour and also just leaving it very, very light. It's so tempting to just paint. So where you see, like, especially that foreground lighter area, just a bit of light raw in it, so tempting to paint over it. But now I'm going back into the white and just This is just the water now. Bringing some of that water right up to the shore, up against the rocks. You can see where you get the nice contrasts with the sort of the white of the spray of the water, that Chinese white, up against those dark rocks. Or at least you will do when I finally get round to it. I think it's coming. Is it coming now? Yeah, I can see the white on the brush, so I think I was just keen to get a bit of spray up there. And that would have worked well if I'd have just left it alone then, but I know I'll come back in a bit with a bit more colour, just to soften off some of this white. I felt as if I'd just overdone it a little bit. It's nice just as the white. Obviously you have to be careful when the brush is fully loaded, but when you've got rid of most of the paint, then you can just quickly whiz around some of the darks and just to let off a little bit of the light white on there without any sort of fear of making a total mess. So I've gone back to the little hake brush. I just wanted to give the impression of a bit of sand under those waves I'd just done, so I just brushed in a bit of raw sienna there. And as always, I've probably just overdone it slightly. Really what you should do is just, depending on how much patience you got, but I'm sure some of the masters in days gone by, I read about the one I think where you just do like a couple of strokes, go and stand miles away from it, have a good look, and then go in just another couple of strokes, then go back. I suppose it's all right if you've got the time, I'd imagine, but I don't know if I'd have the patience for that. Just pausing every few strokes and having a look at it from a distance. So what I've done now, I've switched to the sword liner, a sort of dark mix, and then just adding a few dark lines in this foreground area, just to suggest the sort of really dark recesses and nooks and crannies in these foreground rocks. And then never be afraid to get your fingers dirty. That's one of the advantages of watercolours. I like to just shove my fingers and nails in there as well. Make all sorts of weird and wonderful marks on the paper. Get your thumb in there and just mix it all up and move the paint around. Because with watercolour it just washes straight off. That's one of the big advantages over oil. You can just make a mess and it just washes straight off. So just making a few dark marks in the sea area as well. And then where I slightly overdo it, I'll just brush it with a thumb or finger. See, a lot of the times I don't think too much about it. It'll be more trial and error than sort of a proper thought process. Just whack a mark in. If I don't like it, just wipe it off with my finger, and what's left is just part of the painting. So I just wanted to suggest a few more rocks in the distance. So I'm just adding them in with that little 1/4 inch flat brush. And again, these little rocks, they'll just all help add the interest. But they need to be small, especially those ones right in the distance, just to help maintain the scale. So at this point, I'm feeling that it's very close to completion now. I'm just sort of looking around, just adding little touches here and there. Just wondering what else can I do just to add that little bit more realism to it, but sort of still trying to keep it sort of semi-abstract sort of type of thing. It's just a delicate balancing act. So here's the finished paint in the main. So if we go and have a closer look at it, so I think the first thing to point out, you can see where it sort of switches from the lighter, more distant tones, and there's a sort of line across there into the darker, stronger tones of the middle and foreground. So you can see the distant headland there, and then a little bit of Chinese white there. It's just a few waves and things, and then the water line in the distance. Also got a distant bit of headland here, a little bit of white mixed in as well. And then you can see, then we start to get into the darker, stronger tones, and this sort of contrast between the darker foreground and middle ground tones against the lighter, distant tones just helps create that sense of depth. Just using the 4 colours as well just helps keep everything harmonious. See, a lot of it, the darks are just pretty much Payne's grey, ultramarine, and then you've got the sort of raw sienna suggesting the sky colour, a little bit of the water. You can see some of the beach colour underneath, and then also the grass in the cliffs. Just use that same colour to represent all three, just to create that sense of harmony. Chinese white comes in very, very handy when you want to suggest like water, you know, splashes of waves and things crashing against the rocks. Especially, we see the contrast there, the white waves against the dark coloured rocks. Works quite nicely. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks as always for your support, patrons. At patreon.com/Stephen Cronin. Support always very much appreciated. I hope you all enjoy the videos, and remember to keep posting all your paintings on the community page. Great to see what everyone's up to. So if you've got any questions, please ask. Keep practicing, and I'll see you again soon.